So one of the criticisms now is because you forget the lessons of 20th century history and the atrocities committed under communism, that you may be a little bit more willing to accept some of those ideologies into the United States society. That this kind of that forgetting that capitalistic forces are part of the reason why we have what we have today. There's a fear amongst some now that we would allow basically communism to take hold in America. I mean, Jordan and others speak to this kind of idea. I tend to not be so fearful of it. I think it's on the surface. It's not deep within. I do see the world as very complicated, as there needing to be a role of having support for each other on certain political levels, economic levels, and then also supporting entrepreneurs. It's like that the kind of enforcing of outcomes that is fundamental to the communist system is not something we're actually close to. And some of that is just fear mongering for likes on Twitter kind of thing.
Yep. If I could come in on that, because I agree with you 100%. I've spent a lot of time writing and looking at this and talking to people about this. There's no communism in the United States. There never has been, and there certainly isn't now. And I'll say this both from an academic point of view, but also from just spending a lot of time observing young people in the United States. Even those on the farthest left, take whoever you think is the farthest left, they don't even understand what communism is. They're not communist in any sense. Americans are raised in a vernacular and environment of private property ownership. And as you know better than anyone, if you believe in private property, you don't believe in communism. So what the sort of Bernie Sanders kind of socialist elements, that's very different, right? And I would say some of that, not all of that, some of that does harken back to actually what won in the Cold War. There were many social democratic elements of what the United States did that led to our winning the Cold War. For example, the New Deal was investing government money in propping up business, in propping up labor unions. And during the Cold War, we spent more money than we had ever spent in our history on infrastructure, on schools, on providing social support, social security, our national pension system being one of them. So you could argue actually that social democracy is very compatible with capitalism. And I think that's the debate we're having today, how much social democracy. I'll also say that the capitalism we've experienced the last 20 years is different from the capitalism of the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was the presumption in the United States that you had to pay taxes to support our Cold War activities, that it was okay to make money, but the more money you made, the more taxes you had to pay. We had the highest marginal tax rates in our history during the Cold War. Now, the aversion to taxes, and of course no one ever likes paying taxes, but the notion that we can do things on deficit spending, that's a post-Cold War phenomenon. That's not a Cold War phenomenon. So much of the capitalism that we're talking about today is not the capitalism of the Cold War. And maybe, again, we can learn that and see how we can reform capitalism today and get rid of this false worry about communism in the United States.
Yeah, you make me actually realize something important. What we have to remember is the words we use on the surface about different policies, what you think is right and wrong, is actually different than the core thing that is in your blood, the core ideas that are there. I do see the United States as there's this fire that burns of individual freedoms, of property rights, these basic foundational ideas that everybody just kind of takes for granted. And I think if you hold on to them, if you're raised in them, talking about ideas of social security, of universal basic income, of reallocation of resources is a fundamentally different kind of discussion than you had in the Soviet Union. I think the value of the individual is so core to the American system that you basically cannot possibly do the kind of atrocities that you saw in the Soviet Union. But of course, you never know. The slippery slope has a way of changing things. But I do believe the things you're born with It's just so core to this country. It's part of the. I don't know what your thoughts are. We are in Texas. Not necessarily. I don't necessarily want to have a gun control type of conversation, but the reason I really like guns, it doesn't make any sense, but philosophically, it's such a declaration of individual rights that's so different than the conversations I hear with my Russian family and my Russian friends. That the gun, it's very possible that having guns is bad for society in the sense that like it will lead to more violence. But there's something about this discussion that proclaims the value of my freedom as an individual. I'm not being eloquent in it, but there's very few debates where whenever people are saying, would you have what level of gun control, all those kinds of things, what I hear is it's a fight for how much freedom, even if it's stupid freedom, should the individual have.
I think that's what's articulated quite often. I think combining your 2 points, which are great points, I think there is something about American individualism which is deeply ingrained in our culture and our society, and it means that the kinds of bad things that happen are different, and usually not as bad. But our individualism often covers up for vigilante activity and individual violence toward people that you wouldn't have in a more collective culture. So in the Soviet Union, it was at a much worse scale, and it was done by government organizations. In the United States, it's individuals. The history of lynching in our country, for example. Sometimes it's individual police officers. Sometimes it's others. Again, the vast majority of police officers are good people and don't do harm to people. But there are these examples, and they are able to fester in our society because of our individualism. Now, gun ownership is about personal freedom, I think, for a lot of people, and there's no doubt that in our history, included in the Second Amendment, which can be interpreted in different ways, is the presumption that people should have the right to defend themselves, which is what I think you're getting at here, that you should not be completely dependent for your defense on an entity that might not be there for you. You should be able to defend yourself. And guns symbolize that. I think that's a fair point. But I think it's also a fair point to say that as with everything, defining what self-defense is really important. So does self-defense mean I can have a bazooka? Does it mean I can have weapons that are designed for a military battlefield to mass kill people? That seems to me to be very different from saying I should have a handgun or some small arm to defend myself. That distinction alone would make a huge difference. Most of the mass shootings, at least, which are a smaller proportion of the larger gun deaths in the United States, which are larger than any other society, but at least the mass shootings are usually perpetrated by people who have not self-defense weapons, but mass killing weapons. And I think there's an important distinction there. The Constitution talks about a right to bear arms for a well-regulated militia. When the framers talked about arms, that did not mean the ability to kill as many people as you want to kill. It meant the ability to defend yourself. So let's have that conversation. I think it would be useful as a society. Stop talking about guns or no guns. What is it that we as citizens need to feel we can defend ourselves?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, guns have this complicated issue that it can cause harm to others. I tend to see sort of maybe in like legalization of drugs, I tend to believe that we should have the freedom to do stupid things.
Yeah. So long as we're not harming lots of other people.
Yes. And then guns, of course, have the property that they can be used. It's not just this, a bazooka, I would argue, is pretty stupid to own for your own self-defense, but it has the very negative side effect of being potentially used to harm other people.
Right.
And you have to consider that kind of stuff. By the way, as a side note to the listeners, there's been a bunch of people saying that Lex is way too libertarian for my taste. No, I actually am just struggling with ideas and sometimes put on different hats in these conversations. I think through different ideas, whether they're left, right, or libertarian. That's true for gun control. That's true for immigration. That's true for all of that. I think we should have discussions in the space of ideas versus in the space of bins we put each other in, labels and we put each other in.
I agree 100%.
And also change our minds all the time. Try out, say stupid stuff with the best of intention, trying our best to think through it, and then after saying it, think about it for a few days, and then change your mind and grow in this way.